Great to see everyone. Gosh, all at once. Um, Welcome to everyone that's listening, wherever you're listening from. Friends in England, in Hawaii, in Chicago, in Alpine, Madison, and elsewhere. I'm Ann Lipscomb, and we have a treat this morning. One of our Sangha members, Mason McClay, is going to join us, and we're going to do a question answer after a little introduction about his work as a neuroscientist and a researcher, and contemplative practice or Zen, and how those things interact and affect one another. So there'll be a small talk introduction, and I get to ask the first question, and then we'll open it up for people to ask questions, raise their hands. Sandra will be, our monitor will be calling on people for questions for Mason. And we won't have breakout groups, but we'll just continue on with questions. And like I told Mason, if nobody else has questions, I have a million, so no problem. But so without further ado, I'll introduce Mason McClay and start out with kind of a many way seeking mind talk. If you could tell us, Mason, what brought you to contemplative practice? How did that journey start? I think you're muted, Mason.
Mhm.
You're still muted. Sandra, can you unmute Mason?
Let me unmute him. I already unmute him, so is
There we
his
go. There we go. No,
is his system, is his computer.
it's still not working, Mason. Sorry. You got to fiddle. No. Yeah. Let's see. Go away, come back again. Go away, come back again. Let's see. So while he's gone, he's actually, I think this is the last day he's here in Austin. He's getting ready to go to California to do his advanced degree. Maybe we can unmute all for a second, Sandra.
Okay.
I guess mute everyone again.
Can you hear me?
Yay, you're like in a well somewhere.
All right. Okay. Is that working?
Yay.
Oh
Yeah.
my God. I'm so sorry. That was so strange.
Who knows? Who knows?
The only thing I will ask if everybody can mute themselves, the ones that I mute, so we can.
Yeah, so Kim and Nancy, I guess, and Kavana need to mute themselves if they can. Yeah, great. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Sorry about that little delay. So I guess to answer your question, I used to think that my introduction to contemplative practice was sort of unconventional. But after moving to Austin and just meeting more people really across the South, I began to realize a lot of people had somewhat similar experiences to me. Basically, when I was around 14 or 15, I was dealing with quite a bit of issues, including significant drug abuse. And I was expelled from high school. It was actually the father of someone I was tutoring, introduced me to a particular type of practice that was very intensely related to sort of offshoots of different contemporary Hindu practices that had made their way to the Midwest. And I began going to those community practices with him and just immediately got swooped up into it. It gave me a perfect outlet to begin to deconstruct the problems I was having and reorient myself toward my relationships in my life. And it ultimately culminated in me traveling to India when I was 16 and staying in a temple to study with the monks of this particular tradition for a few months. And then teaching different facets of this particular tradition throughout the Midwest in my teenage years. Over time, I began to realize that there were some issues with how the particular tradition was manifesting in the community, and there were a lot of issues with control. Because I was younger, I wasn't necessarily able to see how those things were being abused until later. So when I left to go to college and began studying neuroscience, which I knew I wanted to study, a lot of the experiences I had through this contemplative practice began opening me up to all the sorts of radical but really simple states of consciousness. And I just knew that I wanted to try to understand those through what I thought would be an appropriate lens, which was, in my mind, neuroscience, and to some degree still is. And obviously, that's what I'm doing. So I went to college, and my research advisor, who I met right off the bat, happened to be the head of a program at my college called the Contemplative Studies Initiative. And he was a trained Zen teacher. So I pretty quickly began studying Zen in somewhat an informal way through him. But I did end up going to Japan with him for about 2 months to study mostly at some Rinzai temples, and nothing too in depth. It was mostly like a cursory look of some of the interaction between science and Zen, and how those things were actually brought to bear in contemporary discourse. So that led me to, I suppose, a part of this whole trajectory for me was beginning to deconstruct the sorts of aversions I built when I was younger, when I was in that very rigorous community, and sort of taken advantage of. So I had to separate myself from more of a theological context pretty radically, and sort of embed a lot of what I had learned within philosophy and neuroscience, and sort of a broader outlook. So around that time, that's when I graduated college and I came to Austin and joined Appamada, and as much as possible began taking my Zen studies a bit more seriously, and sort of like coming full circle with the questions I don't know could be answered through neuroscience, are better left to just be experienced. And that's that. And I suppose that's where I am at the present moment.
Yeah, that's great. I guess I wanted to mention to people too that you're a poet and a digital and visual artist, and so I think that informs your broader perspective that you were talking about.
Yeah.
So, a basic question about neuroscience, what's the broad question that either neuroscience or you, particularly in neuroscience, are trying to answer?
So that's a great question, and this is something I'm going to try to outline a little bit later, but maybe it's good to just talk about it now. One of the biggest projects in especially in neuroscience, especially cognitive neuroscience, where you're working with multiple ontologies. What I mean by that is you're not just looking at, oh, what does the brain do? You need to know what process are we interested in? And what does that mean in terms of people's experience? And then what does that mean in terms of people's behavior? And what are the outcomes of all of those correlates? And how do we actually measure those things? So a huge project of neuroscience in general is this issue of what's considered to be construct validity. It's this idea that you might have a construct in mind, you might have a certain thing you want to study, but you can only study that thing as well as you have measurements for it, right? So if you want to ask the question of, what's happening in the brain when people are engaged in mindfulness? Well, you have to have an idea of what mindfulness is, which is going to be based off of your a priori assumptions, right? But then that's also going to be confounded by what you can actually measure. So if you just tell someone, oh, well, tell me how mindful you are while you're, in a brain scanner, that's going to be confounded by their own ideas of mindfulness. But if you develop like a scale where you ask them to answer different questions about their experience of mindfulness, that's going to depend on the questions you come up with, which are going to be biased toward your own theory of mindfulness. So in general, a lot of the early mindfulness research in neuroscience came from a well-being or wellness perspective. So just trying to understand, if we take complete novices and then we take expert meditators from Tibet with over like 30,000 hours of meditation experience, and we just compare their health outcomes. We ask them to engage in something like a metta or loving kindness meditation. How do their brains differ? So that was like a really easy way at first for neuroscientists to compare just really basic things about what mindfulness might be doing and what the outcomes of mindfulness or meditation are. And a lot of that early work was just showing some things that were pretty expected, and then some things that were like completely counterintuitive. So some things that were totally expected is, people who are expert meditators are good at doing that. Like they're able to sit and behaviorally they're able to actually engage in the practice. However, one thing that was totally unexpected is a lot of the neural results that compared expert meditators to novices were a bit counterintuitive, where you had these circuits of the brain, especially in the prefrontal cortex, that are known to engage in like high regulatory behaviors or be correlated with regulatory behaviors, like orienting your attention toward things, regulating your emotional responses to fearful stimuli and things of that sort. They were actually, the activity of those regions and those circuits was actually higher in the novices than in the expert meditators. And so, so that sort of threw a wrench in a lot of the early meditation work. Just saw my video.
See you.
Oh yeah, hi. Sorry, I didn't realize my video was not on my phone.
Right.
So that threw quite a big wrench in the early work. However, a lot of people began to realize that perhaps what's happening with the expert meditators is they have an orientation of acceptance, right? And there's still a bit of a tension and a debate. You can make different predictions based off different theories you have, where, one theory might be, oh, the expert meditators have practiced regulation so much that their brains have just gotten used to that. They can immediately regulate. There is so much neuroplasticity that they don't have to engage in those same particular circuits in order to have the emotional regulation. So one theory might suggest that it is something that they carry with them as they go. They're just in a hyper-regulated state. However, other theories might suggest that they aren't really regulating at all. And the difference comes with how they appraise their experience after the fact. And actually, there's some recent research that supports the second hypothesis. It's actually some work using pain. So if you shock monks or expert meditators and then shock novice meditators, the salience networks that detect pain, like the insula, which represents body arousal, is actually higher. The activity of that region is higher in the expert meditators. However, the baseline activity before the pain occurs, even when they know it's going to happen, so this anticipatory reaction to the pain, is actually much lower in the expert meditators.
So you might say, I'm going to jump in. So you might say, what the novice meditators are more engaged in control of what they experience,
Right.
and the expert less control, more watching, more observation, more curiosity. But also, if they have greater activity with a painful stimulus, then maybe more actually, I don't know, paying attention, more actually engaged
Yeah.
with what's happening, but not, but let go of that. Not so like a long holdover, okay, story about what did that mean, and oh my God, I
Right.
gotta get out of here, sort of thing.
Right. And in fact, that is what they find. They find that, there's a process of habituation. So how long does it take you to get used to the pain? And in the expert meditators, they habituate much more rapidly than the novices. So I think that honestly, this is the crazy thing is, the people doing this research aren't even necessarily coming up with these interpretations like what you just proposed. But that's, I think, a really valid interpretation of what might be happening. And so there needs to be better discourse between people actually practicing and people trying to do the science.
Yeah.
That's sort of a roundabout answer to your.
No, that's good because that's sort of what the teaching would imply, the teaching of Zen, the teaching of contemplative practice, that your your awareness is more open and less attached.
Right. Yeah.
And I know I've heard Peg and other teachers say the way you can tell an experienced meditator is how long it takes them to turn or drop the thing that just happened and go on to the next thing.
Yeah. Yeah. There's one theoretical model proposed by Richard Davidson, who some people in Sangha might be familiar with. He's one of the most famous neuroscientists because he is the most cited neuroscientist, and he happens to have a very lasting interest in mindfulness practice since the late 90s. And his model, which he proposed back in 2010 or so, is sort of a reorientation model where you engage in regulation, your mind drifts, and then you reorient. Fairly simple, but because of issues with construct validity and measurement, it actually was well beyond any other, what I would call a univariate or a very linear model that isn't necessarily proposing this model's proposing a more of an iterative circular process, whereas other models weren't. But even then, that's only one little feature of what you just introduced.
Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, that's sort of what I'm interested in is how does the science currently
Mm-hmm.
um, equate with the teachings, what's been said, what's going to happen.
Right.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. And I know last Sunday, Chris gave a wonderful talk about um, the nature of time and the nature of
Yeah.
understanding,
Mm-hmm.
what it means to understand something and how we do that, and talked a lot about um, what you're just saying, that it depends on how you can measure, it depends on your a priori um, assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
And so that changes. Do you
Right.
think do you think our minds actually change when the ability to our brains actually change when your ability to apprehend a new possibility or get a new measuring device?
So, do you mean the brains of meditators when they apprehend?
Just in
I see.
general for people, if you kind of
Right.
open up your experience,
Yeah. Yeah.
something happens, like you get
Right.
a new measurement instrument or a new telescope or a new micro,
Oh, I see.
um, or you
Yeah.
have,
Sure. I mean, these are all empirical questions that like you can't say so for sure unless you have the data. But I mean, our brains are always changing. So I'd imagine that when you develop a new measurement device, that especially something like, like a telescope, like what was a telescope like to 16th century Italian, that probably like completely changed Galileo's brain, you
uh,
know, compared to the a normal Italian. Even if you controlled or compared him to another, maverick astrologer or physicist,
uh,
I'm sure you would have seen differences just because he was looking through a lens every night that
yeah,
let him like reappraise. Especially with something like that, something I've been really interested in since I began meditation practice. And one of the first avenues I found that I think connected meditation and meditation research um, is this whole field of emotion regulation.
mm,
Um, and emotion regulation in general is sort of one of those like dual model systems where you have people mainly studying reappraisal, which is when you like develop a sort of explanation for something that you're experiencing, and suppression, which is a form of regulation where you just suppress what you're experiencing.
mm,
Suppression is known to be correlated with all sorts of poor health outcomes,
interesting.
including heart failure. So
Wow.
people who suppress are more likely to have heart attacks, 40 years later in life.
Mm,
Whereas reappraisal is correlated with a lot of more healthy behaviors and also reduce psychopathology and reduce risk of all sorts of health outcomes. And the thing is, though, reappraisal can mean so many different things.
huh.
There are some people who are actually trying to break down what reappraisal is, and one of the big ones is temporal and distal reappraisal. So when people situate themselves in a much broader temporal context.
A bigger picture.
Yeah. Or in Galileo's case, seeing that the Earth is a speck, when in comparison to all the stars,
Right.
even in the immediate vicinity of what the telescope can see, that must have altered how he reappraises, day-to-day issues in his life.
The rest of his experience. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that'd be my guess at least.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna hold off on my burning question and open it up
Cool.
for and Sandra's gonna call on people if this has provoked questions, and if not, I'll ask mine.
So King has a question. Let me just Me siento.
Yeah. So how can this help us? And what I'm thinking of is I know there's a device for deaf piano tuners where they can tune a piano because this device will tell them what note actually when they hit the key, what note they're hearing, and then they can move. So how can seems like a lot of this is after the fact that you're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, what does the expert meditator do and so forth. But are there any means like devices, for example, that you could use to see if you're meditating or not? Whatever that means.
Right. What is it?
So, no, that's a great question. I mean, I was actually having a conversation with my old research advisor from Centre College, where I went to undergrad, and I was telling him about how we were going to do this, and he was like, yeah, you know, it's common that different Buddhist communities are really interested in the science, but, you know, there's always the further question of what is it actually, how does it go beyond the sutras and the theology and the philosophy of the practice itself? And that's definitely something where it's like, I'll get to like an actual practical application in a second, but I do think going back to what I had mentioned earlier, even being able to map the different forms of understanding of, Dogen's idea of sunyata and like a neuroscientist's idea of like radical metacognition or meta awareness, I think can be very powerful for theoretical reasons and to just understand really basic features of consciousness. But to actually get to a practical application, neurofeedback is actually, and biofeedback are two different methods that have been used to train people to handle a lot of different adverse physiological reactions to day-to-day information and contexts. So probably a good example of this is people with PTSD can be trained to essentially observe even their heart rate and be able to regulate the variability in their peak-to-peak heart intervals, which is correlated with sympathetic activation, which is essentially your fight or flight response. So you can hook people up to a machine that actually tells them what their sympathetic arousal looks like. You might just correlate their sympathetic arousal with like a picture of a thermometer. And let's say when the thermometer hits 100, that means their sympathetic arousal is low, but they might not even know that. So it's kind of interesting is you can implicitly train people to actually have lower adverse reactions or to have a better tonic, more healthy tonic physiological state. And that could be applied to meditation as well. There are a few people who have done this. There are a few studies that came out recently at the University of California at San Francisco that have applied neurofeedback to novice meditators, in particular students. But a lot of really cool work is actually being done at UT. It's kind of crazy. We actually did a study using some of this technology, but essentially there's something called, not to get too terminological, but it's called multivariate pattern analysis. This idea that you can track brain activity using a machine learning algorithm. So let's say that I train you to remember a series of words in one list. And then I train you to remember a series of words in another list. And then the next day I bring you back. And let's say I had you in like a brain scanner, fMRI the whole time. The next day I bring you back and I try to get you to remember the lists. The idea is that your brain activity that was similar to list one, if that is active in your brain before I start telling you to remember different words from the lists, you're more likely to remember the list one words. So some way that this might be relevant to meditation practice is, especially people who might have very clear psychopathologies where you can disentangle or dissociate like an adverse reaction like in a fear task and then a mindfulness task afterwards. You might be able to train them on both tasks and then present them with ambiguous information later on. And perhaps you could even present them with, similarly, like a thermometer that actually changes based off of how much mindfulness neural context that their brain is engaged in. And if you give them neurofeedback to make their brain more mindfulness-y, then they would be more likely to appraise the new information through a mindfulness context. So that's one way that you could potentially train people, especially people with psychopathologies.
Yeah. Does it answer your question, Kim?
Well, I'll keep working on Mason.
Okay. Thanks.
Next. John has a question.
My question involves a lot of assumptions on little knowledge, so it may be incorrect. But my question is, how can we get this species so it's not self-destructing? And I'm thinking of how we don't see that we're connected to the environment. We're into our self-centered dream and greed. And from what I know, first of all, that's what meditation is all about. That's why we are here. But it takes a long time. And from what I've heard, we are needing to activate the right side of our brain, but the left side of the brain, is just grabbing all our attention. And so I'm wondering, I know that this is what we're all doing, but it takes so long. And I wonder if you know of other ways to activate the right side so that we are more inclined to see how we are tied to everything.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit to unpack there.
Did you hear me?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think I got your full question.
Did my question not come across? I'm not getting any response.
I think it came across. Let me try to reiterate it to see if I got it right. So you're wondering how we could leverage the features of the right side of the brain that seem to be related to a sense of interconnectedness to make us feel more related, which we are, to nature, natural surroundings, and probably each other as well. Is that the question?
I think Joan's frozen somehow. Joan's.
I think so.
That was my understanding of the question, so maybe you could take off with that.
Sure. So I guess the first thing to address is sort of like, there are a lot of sort of rogue theories about very simplistic models of the brain, which don't really map to what we understand.
So that we stop thinking just of our. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. So maybe a better way to, so there actually is some evidence. There's some evidence that midline structures of the brain, so structures that run along the divide of the brain, the corpus callosum, are related to self-referential processing. And people who have a hard time with rumination, or people who are in a deep state of like mind wandering and just thinking about themselves and their particular memories of themselves through their own first-person perspective, they tend to have hyperactivity in these midline structures. And actually, people who practice in meditation for some time have some deactivation of these structures. And this is especially true when people are practicing compassion-related meditation types. What's considered in some circles of psychology to be like constructivist families of meditation practice, where you're focusing on others and you're using a particular ethical framework. And I'd imagine like a meditation involving interconnectedness would certainly fit this family of meditation types. And what we see is there's a deactivation of these midline structures, but there's also an activation of regions of the brain that are considered to be relevant for simulating other people's experience. If you're interested in what they're called, I mean, one's called the anterior cingulate cortex. Doesn't really matter for the sake of this, but the point being that there are quite a few like rogue theories out there that sort of propose like, oh, left versus right brain, or, you know, brainstem versus everything else. But really, we're still learning so much of this. And I think one of the earliest findings we had, that the neuroscience and meditation had, and one of the most robust findings we still have, is this sort of deactivation of midline structures and engagement with other structures related to appraising other people. Now, like totally outside of the scientific context, I think of a lot of human behavior in terms of like hierarchical networks. So maybe to better help people feel more interconnected with each other and with nature, that takes more of like macro cultural changes, where you have people whose voice get represented in media and in politics and even in science, I suppose, and philosophy, who actually orient themselves toward a more compassionate stance toward humanity. And I think that these behaviors and these orientations get learned from a pretty early age. And that doesn't mean that we can't decondition ourselves and learn how to be more compassionate, or have a greater, more broad ethical stance toward each other. But trying to hack the brain, if you will, I don't know, is the most effective way of getting at major change for not just yourself, but for like a whole culture.
We're not going to be able to give people a pill or shock them.
Yeah.
Something.
Most likely not. And I don't know if we would want to. So, yeah, well, great question. Thank you.
Yes, Monica.
Hi, everyone. And Mason, thank you for talking to us. It's fascinating. I wanted to know if you would go back and talk about, so you talked about the emotional regulation and the part in the dual model, the reappraisal, and give some more examples of how that's being used. Real life examples of how it's being used in positive psychological, physiological ways. It's so wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. So yeah, there's so much work being done on reappraisal. Someone you might want to look into is James Gross. And Gross is spelled as you'd think, Gross. He's at Stanford, and he kind of popularized a lot of affective theory and emotion regulation work in the early 90s. And he sort of proposes a framework of reappraisal of it being an antecedent model of regulation, where if you adopt an orientation toward reappraisal, you're going to try to take on a new perspective for maybe something that you would normally not like in your environment, before you actually fully experience your adverse reaction to it. Which that's one framework to explain why it might be healthier for you. You don't let the emotional cascade to happen and induce all sorts of negative physiological reactions to something, which could cause health problems down the road. It has been extremely successful in trying to understand where certain people with pathologies like generalized anxiety disorder, depression, and PTSD fail in their interactions with their environment. So people with those psychopathologies tend to be very bad at reappraising. And if you can train them, then that actually seems to help quite a bit. Although one thing I'm pretty interested in is what in psychology they call these individual differences. So some people might actually have negative reactions to reappraisal training. I have a friend who was just diagnosed with cyclothymia, which is, a form of bipolar disorder. It's sort of typified by these cycles of mania and dissociation. And she's someone who, just from knowing her and her experience with therapy, she, if she engaged in too much reappraisal, that might actually be bad in the sense that it might induce dissociation. Especially if it's something like distal reappraisal, imagining yourself as a very small, object among other objects. So certain types of reappraisal might actually have negative outcomes for certain types of people. However, what I also find very interesting is while there are some people that are attempting to dissociate different types of reappraisal, that work is still very nascent. So we still don't know that much about, what are the differences between just trying to understand, let's say at the end of the day, you had a bad day and you're like, well, let me just think about how that day fits into my broader week. That might be a form of temporal reappraisal where you sort of like stop your reaction in the moment by embedding it in a bigger week, and hopefully you had some good experiences that week and you can feel a little bit better. But we still don't know the difference between that and like Galileo, who might have been like lambasted by the courts of Italy, the royal court, and looks into his telescope and sees Jupiter and is able to imagine human beings being this tiny speck of civilization amongst like all this vast space. We don't know how the brain is dissociating those two different experiences. And in fact, there's some recent work that's trying to integrate some neuroscience with philosophy of space and time, and suggesting that how we appraise space and how we appraise time really isn't that different. It's sort of like we develop these physical theories for space and time and then just sort of map that and try to force it onto our understanding of the brain. But it seems like our brain isn't necessarily like, we don't have neurons specific to time and neurons specific to space. We have our hippocampus and its regions that is constantly tracking our context, which includes time, right? So it's tracking how time flows, it's tracking how things change over time, which coincides with the space that you're in. So that's a great question. I would say look into James Gross and you'll see some really interesting work that might help answer that a little bit further.
Thank you.
So,
Let's take two more questions, Sandra.
Caroline is next.
Okay. Hey, Mason. It's good to
Hey.
see you.
You too.
So I have another complicated question. I'm
Sure.
I'm getting my master's in social work. So my focal point is the interaction of early trauma. And then what I understand from like Bessel van de Kolk or Bruce Perry is that you literally, parts of your brain are stunted in their growth. So what I'm curious is there an ability for the practice of meditation to actually grow areas that have been stunted due to the early trauma, or is it irreversible? That's part one. And then two, it's like then
Yeah.
for somebody that does have early trauma where they're trapped in that inner child quite often, it's like, where is the, what are the types of, and I don't know, you mentioned metta or compassion techniques. So what are the best meditative techniques to kind of help guide them towards working with that inner child part that they keep getting triggered in?
Yeah. So I'll definitely preface this by saying that I don't have much knowledge of developmental psychology. And this is total speculation. So, especially because it's like a clinical context, you know, take this all with a grain of salt. But to answer your first question, I definitely think that there are potential avenues for recovery. Again, case by case basis. But something like meditation should be able to, depending on the form of meditation, should be able to allow some redevelopment of certain processes that might have been hindered or, you know, developing in an aberrant way due to the trauma. So there's one thing that we know or beginning to understand about traumatic disorders is that there tends to be, your brain tends to have sort of a mix-up or an aberrant processing of your context when you have trauma. So in particular, when you learn that something's fearful, especially a very traumatic experience, that fear memory isn't necessarily specific to where you had the encounter. So the fear memory actually generalizes to many other contexts. But what makes recovery from trauma so tricky is that, let's say that you were hit by a car and now you're afraid of cars everywhere, right? But you began to learn that cars are safe only when you're, you know, in a residential area like Hyde Park, for example. That what's called a safety memory is going to be very specific to that area. So a big part of at least what I know about clinical application, clinical research for trauma is trying to learn how we can generalize the safety memory to other contexts. In children, I imagine that, you know, becomes much more tricky because when you're in a state of like very important development and your safety context is tied to such a particular state when you're young, it's also going to be confounded by your age, your temporal context, really basic things about learning and memory. So how you begin to learn that, you know, X causes Y and this person means safety and this person means fear. We do know that certain therapies, including some types of mindfulness, at least in adults, actually can help the safety memory generalize to new contexts. But I don't know about whether or not that's true in children. That's probably much more difficult in children. And even then, meditation practice with children is also, and you know, even when you're dealing with totally healthy children with no traumatic experiences, no traumatic history, can be tricky also. And you typically want to start with very simple types of practices. Now, there's some people who'll say like, oh, children are so good at even like really radical open monitoring and metacognition and can engage in these really deep states. But I probably speculate on average, it's still difficult for children to orient their attention. You know, it's something that as your brain develops over time, you become a lot better at being able to reorient your attention, focus on a particular object, and which, you know, many models of meditation suggest that you need this attentional regulation before you can get beyond to something like an open, you know, meditative state. So I'm sorry I can't give like a better clinical answer to that question. I think it's really interesting though. It's really important. Something I'm pretty interested in. So if you want to find some relevant literature.
Yeah. And Charlie Nemiroff, awesome. I think, is doing some of that. Yeah.
Yeah, he is. I work with a research assistant who just got onto his early childhood trauma project. So look forward to seeing what comes out of that.
Yeah.
And Jeffrey Newport also at Dell Med. So
Thanks,
yeah.
Mason.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's do one last question. And we got it.
I don't know. Krzysztof, do you still have a question? Okay. Okay.
Okay, cool. Good to see you, Mason.
You too, Chris.
It's been a while.
Yeah, I like your background.
Thank you. It's the farm I live on. I've gotten quite comfy here.
Nice.
I was glad to hear what you said about human perception of space and time, because space and time are actually one thing. They're materially one thing. So it's nice to know that some people are have the capacity to understand them as the one thing that it actually is.
Yeah.
The curious question I have for you, and I don't know if this would take you too far off field from your topic, but when I study what all the physicists tell us about the nature of reality and the precision with which we can understand everything to the 20th decimal point, that nothing extra is needed to make all these equations work. And then a lot of theorists of the mind come in and say, with something like panpsychism, that's such a limited view, and don't be so narrow-minded, and materialist versus other debate goes on. And to me, it feels like the very edges of the next revolution potentially, or the next step. And I'm curious whether your research has whether it's at all engaged in that debate, or whether you personally have some views on.
Yeah, I love that question. Honestly, like almost no one in cognitive neuroscience is going to be engaged in that debate, but there are some like rogue cognitive scientists who are very interested in basic epistemic and metaphysical questions. I'm beginning to meet some of them because I'm moving to UCLA. I'm actually leaving today, driving across country starting this afternoon. But so I suppose where that begins to overlap with cognitive neuroscience and some of the actual research questions that people like me deal with is there tends to be a culture of reductionism in neuroscience, where you might have like someone who's very, very computational. Maybe their training was with rodents or just like single cell cultures and petri dishes. And all they really care about is what someone developed as like an assay of neural activity and how that might correlate with like, how rats hide behind a corner of a maze as an index of fear. And a lot of people tend to just reduce the experience of fear into that behavior. There's actually a very lively debate going on right now between Joseph Ledoux, who is at NYU, and Michael Fanslow, who's at UCLA, between whether or not fear should be considered as what's accessible to our consciousness, or if we should distinguish between implicit fear, so all the things that we're not aware of that make us fearful, and fear that we can actually perceive. And I become very interested in this debate for almost practical reasons. Like, of course, I'm interested in the ultimate answer to these questions, but I'm interested in for very practical reasons, because if we take a reductionist perspective, we run the risk of ignoring not only the actual experience of people, but how we can actually quantify that experience and measure it. And if we ignore that, then we sort of ignore the entire project of trying to so I mentioned earlier this project of collapsing different ontologies, correlating, a neural substrate, neural activity with behavior and with actual experience. The problem with doing this research for such a long time has been simply that it's been really difficult to actually measure someone's subjective experience, right? The phenomenologists, which began in the early 20th century with Edmund Husserl in Germany, and who trained Heidegger, and then that led to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who was a French philosopher of embodiment, who's someone I absolutely adore. Almost all of that work that focuses on our direct experience and using experience itself to understand really basic structures of human reality. And when I mean human reality, I mean like embodied reality. Like the fact that, as Maurice Merleau-Ponty gives us this example of, a blind man using a cane isn't, a blind man and the cane as separate entities, separate objects that somehow you can build an equation to induce them or embed them into the world. But at some point, the blind man almost becomes his cane. The blind man uses the cane as an extension of himself to interact with the world. Problem is, in contemporary neuroscience, at least from what I've experienced in the United States in particular, I think it's a bit different in Europe, honestly, but the United States in particular, because of our history with analytic philosophy and our history with a certain type of epistemology, we ignore so much philosophy that we could draw on to understand how we can integrate and collapse subjective experience with, physical substrates. It's obviously a difficult problem, but we're developing new technologies like machine learning, pattern recognition, natural language processing is a big one for this in particular, that could actually help us get to the point where we can correlate. Let's say that we give hundreds of monks iPhones, right? And every 10 minutes, just like an ideal experiment in my mind, it's like we give them iPhones with an app that beeps every 10 minutes, that when it beeps, they're supposed to write in their app just basically as best as they can their experience. And throughout the day, we also track their behavior. So when are they practicing Zazen? When are they just eating? When are they like reading scripture? When are they writing? And we use something like natural language processing to track as best as we can their subjective experience with their behavior. Now, maybe we also have like a physiological monitor that measures their heart rates and other processes while they're also engaged in reporting their subjective experience. Now, there are some clear confounds here. Their experience might change by virtue of them actually reporting it. So that makes, this whole project a bit difficult. But I think that this might seem outside of the debate between like panpsychism and materialism, but I think they're much more related than we might expect, because we're really dealing with like subjective phenomenological properties, which is almost a separate ontology, and objective material that we can observe from a third person point of view. I think that's one of the clearest spaces that cognitive neuroscience interacts with these ancient questions of epistemology. I suppose, so I had a friend over the other night who, at 2 a.m., he's sort of like having like a mini panic attack. And he's like, Mason, I don't know, like there are people who are debating like this particular epistemic framework and this particular epistemic framework, but like nothing seems to be pointing to like what's actually real. And I'm just like, that debate's going to continue, and I'd love to be more of a part of it. But I guess right now I'm really interested in how we embody reality, and how reality is so perspectival. And there's so many mysteries within that space in itself. Like the fact that we're even conversing right now on this weird digital platform and I can sort of anticipate or read into your question and try to come up with an answer to your question. Like that in itself is a whole strange intersubjective space that we can't really see, but it's happening all the time.
You know what? And it's funny because I was like, I'm gonna do him a favor and ask him a yes and no question.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I can't say yes or no. It's a problem. Thanks, Chris.
I think we need to say thank you, Mason. This was really, I love it. I know you and I have been trying to do this for a long time, and here we got it on the last few hours that you're here. So
yeah,
so
pretty crazy. Yeah,
yeah.
And
it's been it's been a pleasure. So.
It's only one, somebody Joel was just asking about what is mean implicit memory. I don't know if you can.
I think we're gonna wait.
Okay.
And go ahead and do our chanting and our bowing. And hey, happy trails, Mason. Have a safe.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. It was so nice. It's been awesome time being part of the Sangha, and I'll continue online for as long as that is a thing,
Good.
Much appreciated.
Okay. Thanks.